Hello everyone, and welcome back to the 35th episode of the Grimm Chronicles, where I chat for a little bit about my weekly reads. And if you've been here before, welcome back, and you'll already know that I'm not one of these people who finishes a lot of books within the weekly time frame, so it's a little bit odd that I do these weekly chats, but put it down to my obsessive nature or my completist nature to want to do this, despite the fact that I rarely finish a book. I mean, eventually I do, but not week to week. I did kind of push a little bit to finish my audiobook, and I just finished it just before I started the video, so that's what I'm going to talk about this week. So let me go over what I'm reading, which most of you know already because they've been going on for a couple of weeks now, I think. So I'm still, it's stalled a little bit because of time, but I'm still reading The Door by Magda, Szabo. And then I'm well into Blood Meridian by Cormac, McCarthy, which I hope to finish by the next wrap up, and that will be the focus of that one. So I'm not going to say much about it this week. And the book I just finished on audio, which is The Lives of the Mitford Sisters by Thompson. This was a really interesting read or listen because of how I wasn't really enjoying it in the beginning, but it got better and better, and at the end, so I would say, and it's my own bias, that hearing a lot about Unity, the one who really kind of had a very strange life and fell for Hitler, and even Diana, who married Oswald Mosley, this ridiculous head of the British fascists. And I mean, she's a fascinating person, but just hearing about them, I don't know. But then when it switched to both Nancy and Jessica, and then there's a little bit about Pamela and Deborah, the two, I mean, they're both interesting, but Deborah was interesting because she became the Duchess of Cavendish, so sort of, you know, retained that upper class background even more than the actual Mitfords. But Nancy and Jessica are obviously the two interesting ones, and so even I think the other thing that I didn't really care for in the beginning was, perhaps it's just me, but I really wasn't that. I thought I would be more interested in their lives as children, but I wasn't. I mean, it was fine, but their upbringing was very strange. So I sort of am still surprised that I wasn't more into that. I'm not sure why, but then it got interesting towards the end, or where the adult lives of both Nancy and Jessica were quite interesting. Well, very interesting, not even quite, very. And so I don't know, so this is a sort of the type of book that you have to have a kind of interest in British history and British society, and maybe even the gossipy aspects of high society, which are so much a part of the Mitford's world, even though apparently Evelyn Waugh, who himself is sort of, I mean, they are incredibly posh sounding. If you look at the videos, they all sound extremely hoity-toity. Even Jessica, who ended up in the States, it's very, very posh sounding British accents. And Diana, I mean, there's quite a few videos of old Diana who looks like a statue. She was the beauty of them. They're all good looking, but she was the beauty, and in her old age, such a regal, extremely posh sounding old lady. Ooh. So if you're not into that, you're not going to be into the Mitfords. But if you're interested in history and sort of family saga type stuff, plus the fact that there were 6 sisters, and some of them, I mean, there were so many interesting stories connected to the 6. I think there is this sort of sense of the multitude of them, and the fact that they had all such very different and interesting personalities and lives. And there's a brother too, who people seem to forget, but I do think Thompson did a good job. And one thing I will say right off the bat is I wasn't a big fan of the audio narrator, who wasn't the author, and I just saw a video with Laura herself, and I kind of wish she had narrated her own book, because I have a feeling she probably would have done a better job. The voice of the narrator was fine, and it got better towards the end, but I had some issues, as you know, with the accents and stuff. I guess it isn't easy to read in a way that makes you want to keep listening. And so, yeah. Anyway, so for people who are not in the know, I'm looking at my notes. I apologize for peering at my computer here. So the last part of the book did indeed become a lot more interesting, and even I, who had resisted, became enthralled with the myth of the Mitford sisters. And yes, I have a Pinterest board because there's so many interesting images of them, all of them together and then separately, and it's just lends itself to a Pinterest board as far as I'm concerned. So I'll link that too if you want to look at pictures. It's hard to know how much you all, my viewers, know about them or are interested in them. I know Sarah Hellcover Hearts, she has a true interest in this time period and in the Mitfords, so she'll know all of this stuff, but the others of you may not. So yeah, there's 6 daughters and 1 brother, and their parents, so their father was David, I think the title, he was a lord in the House of Lords, Breesdale. I forget, is he a duke or I'm not quite sure of his title, but so there was David, their father, and Sydney, their mother, who I'm actually interested in, and I tweeted this morning how I thought it was kind of a shame that, so David, the father, has a Wikipedia page because he's the Lord of Breesdale. Well, let me just find out what he is. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. Quick deep dive into the ranks of British nobility, which is of course a rabbit hole out of which one could, in which one could drown, to mix my metaphors. But so he was the second Baron of Redesdale, David Freeman Mitford, second Baron of Redesdale. And in terms of the title, they're pretty low down. They're like the lowest of the low, but they're still peerage. So he was a lord and I guess he was in the House of Lords. And so anyway, point being, their upbringing was very strange. And in a way, I wouldn't mind if anyone has recommendations of a better look at their parents. I'm especially interested in Sydney because she doesn't come off as she comes off as interesting, and she was apparently sort of also upper class. I think there's a Bowles in her surname. Oh, maybe I got that wrong, which of course is Camilla's family. Sorry, I'm getting all gossipy already. But she's interesting because she was very practical and into keeping a household, which if you're upper class, you leave that to other people. And then he was sort of supposedly very eccentric. And I kind of just because I was in the rabbit hole of the Mitfords, found an article about her life where her father, or maybe, I think it was her father, or maybe it was her uncle, he was in charge of her and took her on these boats that he had. And they were like on boats and going to the Middle East on these yachts. And, very strange for this little girl who had lost her mother, I guess, at an early age. So anyway, that's just an aside. So the parents are really interesting, and yet the way this book was, the upbringing, they're very eccentric, and you sort of see the eccentricities of the daughters coming out. And there was a lot of stuff that sounds interesting, but it wasn't that interesting. It was all about the alliances or allegiances between the sisters. And I don't remember that much of it, but apparently one thing that I do need to do more, I think, Nancy in a certain sense is the most interesting of them, Nancy Mitford. She's the oldest. And in a way, she's the writer, she's the creative. She wrote, Jessica also wrote books, Diana wrote her memoirs, but Nancy was, she wrote fiction and then his historical novel, histories of people. But the one thing that comes through is that even though you get a sense that our author loves Nancy the most, for obvious reasons, she's the smart one, so to speak, she's the writer, but she's also kind of mean or cruel, and there's a sense that she was mean and cruel to her sisters too. But then, on the other hand, her mother didn't like Nancy, so it's like, I'm not quite sure what was going on there, but I need to just get a better picture. And to be honest, I've never even read the Mitford novels, the 2 big ones, that are the most well thought of, Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate. I think that's what they're called. And I think there's a new Prime Amazon series of them, but I kind of want to not watch that until I read the books, because I always prefer reading the books because they're usually better, let's face it, unless it's Brideshead. That's an exception. So Nancy was the oldest, and in case the order of I don't want to give you too many dates, but Nancy's the oldest, and then we have Pamela, apparently, then Diana, then Unity, then Jessica, and then the last was Deborah. So Deborah was the youngest, and she's known as Debo. And she's the one that actually married a duke. So, and dukes, in case you're interested, you probably are not, but you know what, I've done the research, I won't tell you. They're under kings and princes. They're the third one down, so they're much higher. So it's king, prince, duke, marquess, I can never say that, marquess, earl, viscounts, and then barons are at the bottom. And then everything under that is, you know, baronets are just kind of like, you know, I don't know. I think Paul McCartney by now is Lord, but it's all, the whole thing about peers is just kind of, yeah, old stuff, old noble stuff. But, so yeah, that's the order of the sisters. And then there was Tom, and I forgot to see where he fits in. I think he was actually pretty important to the family, and unfortunately he was killed in the Second World War in 1945 in Burma. And so we already get into one of the weirdnesses of this family is that they were, I mean, not just them, a lot of other people too in England, they were kind of like pro-German, and not just pro-German, but some of them were very fairly pro-Hitler or pro the Third Reich regime, including Tom. Tom is on the record as saying he didn't want to fight against Germans, which is why he got with a regiment that was fighting the Japanese instead, because he did not want to fight Germans. And both the parents, well, and maybe even the mother more than the father, were pretty pro, or at least didn't really have strong reservations about the Third Reich. Well, the mother, she's, I mean, let's get into the one who was most with the Third Reich, which is Unity. Unity is a very, very strange person. I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb and have and just kind of say, I think she was probably the least intelligent. I don't know, from what I gather, even though Nancy said mean things about her younger sister, Debo. But she's strangely not unevolved. I don't know. And then what happens is she, at some point, quite a few of them decided they liked the Nazis or even the fascists. Diana was all about the fascists. But Unity ends up going to Germany and kind of finagling her way into the upper echelons of Nazi power, including Hitler. And she becomes a good, close friend of Hitler. Not a mistress, even though there's rumors of a Hitler baby, but no. But she truly felt very simpatico with Hitler, to the point where Sydney, her mother, came to have lunch with them. I mean, they hung out with Hitler. I hate Hitler. I mean, not even just because of all the awfulness, but just because such an awful, uninteresting, I mean, I don't know about intelligent, but the Nazis, just no, please don't. And so, yeah, and then, so her fate is to be so upset by the fact that they go to war, England and Germany, is that she goes to Munich one day and shoots herself in the head. This is like just when war had broken out, I think 38, 39, I guess 39. And after that, she is severely injured, and the bullet is in the head, and she gets shipped off back to England. It's quite difficult, and she is sort of like an object of press, people kind of trying to take pictures of her. And she sort of comes back, but she never really fully recovers, and she remains sort of like, they say she has the mental age of a 10-year-old. And so the question of who takes care of her, and apparently her mother took care of her until she eventually did pass away in 1948. She's the first to go. It's a very sad, strange fate of this young woman who threw herself at Hitler and then kind of killed herself when it didn't work. I mean, when the Third Reich, the war. So yeah, that's Unity. And then I guess in terms of the way the book is set up, the next person we talk about in depth is Diana. So Diana is the great beauty, and they go on and on about how men were falling at her feet, and she does have these very classical features. I mean, they're all good-looking women. And I think the author is a little bit like obsessed with, like, she says that Jessica loses her looks and gets fat at the end, the one who goes to America. And I looked at a video of her, and it's like, she looks pretty fine to me. I mean, she's not skinny anymore, but she doesn't look like she's completely lost her looks. I mean, I don't know. But anyway, I digress, pretty sure. So Diana's fate was to be beautiful, and so therefore not kind of seek out men's beauty in the way, or men's adoration, because it was always there for her. And I could sort of see that if you're someone who is sort of thought of as a great beauty, you kind of like scoff at that kind of attention. And so she herself decides that she's completely in love with Oswald Mosley, the head of the British fascists, and a completely awful person in another one. It's sort of like, why? And the level of her faith and loyalty to this man who, you know, had affairs and was just difficult all around. I mean, all of them in the books treat these women, you know, not that well. Typical sort of patriarchal stuff. And so, yeah, and what's interesting about Diana, and there's quite a bit of stuff where they are put into jail. They're taken to jail because of their fascist sympathies and their apparently pro-Nazi sympathies. Although there's always a bit of a question, the British fascists were not always completely on board with all of the Nazi stuff, but, you know, they were fascists and they were they were anti-Semitic. And anyway, she puts the description of her time in jail is sort of interesting, and she does have a steely strength that you see throughout Diana. So on the one hand, she's interesting. On the other hand, I'm like, yeah, well, but she loves Mosley. I'm like, so not that interesting. I mean, sort of. And then so she's in jail, and then she gets out of jail, and you kind of follow her trajectory with where they all end up. And then it hones in on, so Nancy comes and goes, the focus on Nancy comes and goes. I thought Nancy's story became interesting when she finally kind of goes to live in Paris, or live in France at least. And one thing I thought was interesting is how they talk about her, the big love of her life, and how he didn't sort of didn't marry her for one thing, because she was married to someone who, her husband, they divorced in 1957. So the love of her life with this French sort of diplomat in the government of de Gaulle. And I'm sorry, I'm looking at these things here, and looking at her man, Gaston Palevsky, an officer in the French army and a close associate of Charles de Gaulle. And he always used the fact that de Gaulle would not approve of him marrying her as an excuse not to marry her. And she, sort of similarly to Diana, she kind of threw her allegiances at him, despite the fact that he kind of didn't respond as much back to her. And the book seems to make a big deal out of how that meant that that was part of her unhappiness. And I'm sort of a little bit like, maybe that's true, but I don't know. Maybe I don't know what it is. Maybe it's how her writing was not always as convincing. Like, I want to know more about, she kind of made out that Nancy there's a darkness to her, or a sadness to her, despite, and the ending sounds pretty horrific with her cancer that she had. But so on the one hand, she's sort of very witty, and she writes these books, and she's well thought of, but on the other hand, it's as if she kind of, well, there were issues with fertility. She ended up not being able to have children, and I guess she ended up well, she was married to the one guy, but that didn't work out. But so I'm not exactly sure what was supposed to be missing from her life. I mean, she was a successful writer. She's a Mitford. But I think, I guess he also was trying to make us think there was something in her that kept her from not being happy. I need to read more about Nancy. If you have an idea what's going on there, let me know in the comments. And I do really want to read her novels. And maybe even some of her historical stuff. I mean, Frederick the Great, The Sun King, which I know is in the New York Review of Books series, so I do want to do more research on her. And also the fact that one person I am interested in, I've always been interested in Evelyn Orr, and they were very close friends. And apparently one thing that Laura says is that her whole life through, Nancy was jealous of Diana and the fact that men were falling at her feet and her great beauty, including Evelyn Orr apparently. And so that, I guess that could be, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just sort of like, don't want to believe that someone could be that jealous of their sister their whole life long. But maybe, I don't know, maybe, apparently. So Nancy sort of comes in and out, and at the end it's kind of interesting. I mean, the stuff about her writing and her books and her wit. She's very witty, but then she's also described as being kind of cold. but then her mother's cool to her. So like, anyway, it's all over the place there. And then Jessica was very interesting. In a way, Jessica is perhaps the most interesting because she comes to America. And so she's the communist of the bunch, and she fell in love, see here again, another strong person, strong man, Ernest Romilly, the head of the communists. So we have Diana with the fascists, in unity with Hitler, and then Jessica on the other side of the spectrum with this communist person, and she throws a lot in with him, and they kind of, it's kind of exciting. Like they go to the Spanish Civil War, and they're kind of disappeared for a while, and people don't know where they are, but they turn up again. And then what happens is they go to America, and he's in the war as a part of the Royal Canadian Air Force, and I think that's, as I recall, he dies there. So Jessica's on her own. Does she have a kid by then? Maybe a daughter, in America, and she kind of forges her own way as a very successful writer and sort of journalist. There's even kind of an article or book where she calls herself a mudraker. So she works very hard to establish herself as a sort of almost celebrity writer, journalist. And her famous book is The American Way of Death, all about the sort of the unjust ways that America deals with when people die. And it reminds me of a book that I read a couple years ago by Evelyn Waugh, The Loved One, which does take place in America, and I don't think Evelyn Waugh really gets America. And it was a strange little book about the cemetery and about all of that, the business around death. So it's connected to her book too, from the 60s, The American Way of Death, which was apparently very, very influential and a bestseller. So yeah, Jessica's very interesting, her life. And then we have the other two, Pamela and Deborah, who are kind of the lesser lights of the Mitfords. Pamela's sort of, who did she marry? She married this strange person who was a jockey and really into horses and who has his own wiki page, Derek Johnson. And they lived in Ireland. They lived all over. And then Pamela kind of becomes this lady farmer type person. They're all very interested into the land and into animals and farming to a certain extent, all of them. Well, not Nancy as much, she's more urbane. But Pamela for sure, and even Deborah, who becomes the Duchess of Cavendish. So she marries the Duke of Cavendish, and her claim to fame is that she redesigned their big house, which I think is called Chatswood, yeah, so, and she was the one that died the latest, and there's the most about her around on the. She becomes sort of a celebrity too, the Duchess of Cavendish. Apparently she like Elvis Presley. So all kind of funny stuff, and yeah, so very interesting stuff. And I would like to hear from you all. I mean, have you read the Nancy Mitford novels? Are you interested in them? I mean, they are kind of this privileged, but then in spite of their privilege, sort of interesting, not easy lives. And even their upbringing, they were not that well looked after, and all of the girls kind of had to educate themselves, and they didn't have any formal education, so they never went to school. And I think one of them, maybe it was Jessica, she wanted to go to school, but they wouldn't let her. And then Unity, because Unity was strange, was kicked out of school for whatever reason. She was always bringing animals to school, so she got expelled from school, and then poor Jessica couldn't go because of Unity. It's kind of weird. So yeah, that's it. That's my kind of rambly chat about the Mitfords, and the fact that I did kind of fall down into the Mitford rabbit hole, and I do find them fascinating, and I do want to find out more. I also want to read more of War. There is the novel Vile Bodies, which is about the bright young things that specifically Nancy is a part of, and this is sort of the social scene of the 1920s, so it's a little bit connected to Brideshead and Anthony Powell, which I've listened to. I danced to the music in time, and I really enjoyed it too. So yeah, that's it. I don't think I have anything else going on. I'll have to pick a new audiobook. And I want to really try and make sure that I finish Blood Meridian by next week, and I will post about that. It's very good. I was thinking, oh, this isn't that violent, and then it suddenly got more violent. It's very dark, and the inhumanity of this group of people who basically go around scalping everyone they meet and just wreaking havoc is, on the one hand, you know, but it's not causing me great upsetness, because I think he's kind of doing something with it, and he's trying to show that there's a descent into chaos, and it's interwoven with their interactions with this landscape, the desert and now mountainous and winter landscape that they're in. And it's still fascinating and extremely well written, even though it is dark. Yeah, it's dark. Anyway, that's it for me. I hope everyone is doing well, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.